We read a little while ago from John chapter 20, and this morning I'm going to read our second scripture passage for the day, which is Matthew chapter 27, beginning in verse 57, and then going through to the next chapter, 28, verse 15, if you'd like to follow along. Matthew chapter 27, beginning in verse 57, and then on to chapter 28 through verse 15. Matthew writes, "As evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there across from the tomb. The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. "Sir," they said, "we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first." "Take a guard," Pilate answered. "Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. In other words, they fainted. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say, 'His disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep.' If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. Throughout history, there have been those who doubted the resurrection. We see it began very early on, as soon as it occurred. Thomas Jefferson, the 3rd president of our country, who loved the teachings of Jesus, did not believe in the resurrection. In fact, he didn't believe in any of the miraculous events of the Bible. Some years ago, a governor of Louisiana, where we're from, who considered himself a devout Catholic, announced publicly that while he considered himself to be a follower of Jesus, he did not believe that the resurrection actually occurred. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine whose sister is a Methodist minister told me his sister doesn't believe the resurrection actually occurred. The Christian writer Josh McDowell said this: "The resurrection of Jesus is either a cruel, heartless hoax, or it is the most important event in human history. And I agree with that. And today I want to speak to those who might have doubts. And I want to give you 7 reasons from the Scriptures why I believe the resurrection of Jesus Christ actually occurred. When you put these 7 facts together, I think they make a compelling case for the fact of the resurrection. The first is the broken seal. Now, as we just read, the tomb of Jesus was sealed with a burial seal, a cord. This would have been something like police tape at a crime scene today. It would have been a cord wrapped around the entire tomb and then gathered together there at the entrance to the tomb where the rock had been rolled in, and sealed with a type of clay which would then harden. And while it was still soft, the emperor's ring would have been used to put his impression there, and as it hardened, everyone would have known that this is sealed by order of the Roman emperor. The main purpose of a seal ordinarily would be to keep the guards from taking a bribe, to allow someone to come into whatever was being guarded, in this case the body of Jesus. In this case, we know that the purpose of the seal was to keep the disciples from getting in. Now, we know from every account of the resurrection in the New Testament that the seal was broken. The question is, who broke it? Did the Romans break it? Well, they put it there to begin with. Did the Jewish leaders break the seal? Well, they were the ones who paid to have it put there. Would the disciples break it? Well, they have to get past the guards first to do that. So here's the first bit of evidence. The seal was broken. The second fact or evidence is that the stone was rolled away from the tomb's door. This is recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, this stone would have weighed about 2 tons. That's 4,000 pounds. A tomb like this would be slightly below ground. It would have been hewn out of rock. And then a ramp would be placed leading to the tomb, and a giant stone, once the body had been placed inside the tomb, a giant stone would be rolled down the ramp and lodged into the entrance to the tomb. To roll it uphill would be very difficult, to roll it away from the tomb. But by all accounts, the stone had been rolled away from the entrance to the tomb. So our question is, who did it? Did the Roman officials roll the stone away? Well, they were the ones who put it there to begin with. Did the Roman soldiers do it? Well, this would have been death for a Roman soldier to break these orders. Did the Jewish leaders do it? They were the ones who paid to have it there. Did the women roll it away? Mark chapter 16 tells us that as the women were walking to the tomb that first Easter morning, they had a discussion amongst themselves. How on earth are we going to get that stone away so we can get inside the tomb? Did the disciples roll the stone away? They were the ones who were most suspected of doing it early on, and I'm going to show you in a minute why they were the least likely of all. So here's the second fact, the second bit of evidence. The stone was removed from the tomb's door. The third bit of evidence, the third fact, is that the Roman soldiers went AWOL. Matthew 28 tells us that. When they found the tomb open, they did, as military men, they did a most unexpected thing. They went AWOL. Now, we have some military men present this morning, and they could probably tell us a little bit about military discipline, how important it is to carry out orders, to do what you're supposed to do, to be at the place you're supposed to be. And by the way, military discipline amongst the Roman military was known throughout the world. If a soldier went AWOL, that is to say, if he deserted his post, it could mean his life. Yet these Roman soldiers, when they saw the stone rolled away, they fled the scene. And they not only fled the scene, they went right back to their superiors and reported to them what had happened. And evidently, their superiors believed their story. because of what happened next. They bribed them to lie. They didn't say to them, that's impossible, and discipline them, punish them, execute them. They bribed them to keep quiet. Would they have done that if they had any other explanation for the fact that the stone had been rolled away? That's fact number 3. Fact number 4, the many appearances of Jesus after the resurrection. And from here we find all 4 of the Gospels and the book of 1 Corinthians for our material here. Let me ask you a question. How many witnesses to an event would you say would be necessary to convince someone of the truth of something in a court of law, for example? 2? 10? I read a story recently in the paper about a criminal case that involved some mafia types. And these 2 guys were given immunity from prosecution if they would inform on their cohorts in crime. And they did. And based on the testimony of those 2, the people they had committed crimes with, they were found guilty and sent to prison. That's based on the testimony of 2 people. How many people saw Jesus after the resurrection? According to the Bible, over 500 people saw him. He appeared to the women at the tomb, and I cannot emphasize to you enough how important this is when we're looking for evidence about whether or not the resurrection actually took place. Here's why. In the first century, women could not testify in court. Their testimony was considered unreliable. Yet, according to the Bible, all 4 of the Gospels tell this same story, that the very first people to whom Jesus appeared were women. The very first people he asked to go tell the disciples that he had risen were women. If you were trying to make up a story, if you were trying to write a cover story for something that didn't really happen, but you were trying to make up like it did, you'd never write it that way. You'd never write it so that the first people who saw this event were considered unreliable witnesses. He appeared to the 11 disciples in the upper room. Judas by this time was dead. That's from Luke chapter 24. He appeared to Saul of Tarsus on the road to Damascus. And Saul of Tarsus was Jesus' sworn enemy and was on the way to Damascus to persecute Christians when Jesus appeared to him. He appeared to over 500 witnesses at one gathering. Paul wrote about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And when Paul wrote those words, some 25 years after the resurrection, he said, many of those who saw him are still alive today and can be questioned to the truth of their testimony. The people who saw him, they saw his face, they heard his voice, some of them even saw him eat. And the circumstances of the accounts vary. Some saw him at night, others saw him during the day. Some were alone when they saw him, others were in groups. Some were women, some were men. Some were followers, some were not. Some believed when they saw him, some did not. Some were frightened, others worshipped him. That's fact number 4. The fact that he appeared to over 500 people after the resurrection. Fact number 5, the empty tomb. The tomb was empty. Of that there is no dispute. And I'll show you in a moment how logically there's no dispute to that. The fact is proclaimed, the fact of the empty tomb is proclaimed in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians, and so on. It is the heart of the New Testament. The Roman officials admitted the tomb was empty when they paid the guards to tell people that the disciples stole the body. The Jewish leaders admitted it when they bribed the Roman guards to lie. The disciples proved it when they went back to Jerusalem to preach. Remember, this is where the tomb was located, in Jerusalem. The disciples went right back there, literally paces away from the tomb, and preached the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If the tomb was not empty, if the body of Jesus was still in the tomb, all anybody had to do while the disciples were preaching the resurrection was walk over to the tomb and say, look, there's his body. But no one ever did. No enemy of Jesus ever did that. No foe of Christianity ever did that. Not the Romans, not the Jews, not the Pharisees, not the Sadducees, no one. So we know that the tomb was empty. Now, some would say, and I mentioned this at the beginning, some would say, well, the disciples stole the body. Somehow they did it. They got the body, they were embarrassed that this one to whom they had committed their lives had now been crucified and dead and lying there in a tomb. So they stole his body and hid it out of embarrassment. That's a valid doubt. Let me show you why I don't think it's true. The martyr's death of the disciples. The first sermon ever preached was the first Christian sermon was the one Peter preached after the resurrection. It's recorded in Acts chapter 2. The subject of the sermon focused on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He speaks of God's work in history, of the crucified Christ, and of the resurrected Jesus. And he proclaims in Acts chapter 2, this Jesus hath God raised up from the grave, of which we are all witnesses. This is found throughout the Bible. Every time the gospel is preached, the resurrection is included. When Paul summarizes the gospel in Romans 15 and 1 Corinthians 15, and this is probably the earliest record of the gospel actually being put down in writing, a summary of what it was. Paul mentions two facts which cannot be denied, which cannot be not believed and still be the gospel. And they were the atoning death of Jesus on the cross and his bodily resurrection from the grave. Now, some would say, well, the disciples, they stole the body, they perpetrated a fraud. They preached the resurrection of Jesus, all the while knowing that Jesus, in fact, never rose from the grave. And so here's the question. Did the disciples steal the body and keep this lie, this secret amongst themselves until they died? Mark Twain said that the only way three people can keep a secret is if two of them are dead. But let's ask that question. What do we know about the disciples after the resurrection? What do we know about their lives? What do we know, more importantly, about their deaths? From here, my sources are Hippolytus, who was a first-century historian in Rome, and Eusebius, who came to be called the father of church history. What do we know about the deaths of the disciples? Well, Peter was crucified upside down under the Roman Emperor Nero in the 60s. To be crucified upside down, by the way, was his request, considering himself not worthy to be crucified in the way that Jesus was. Andrew, the brother of Peter, was crucified in Greece. According to those who were present, he spoke exhortations to them from the cross. James, the brother of John, was beheaded by Herod 10 years after the first Christian martyr, Stephen. John died of natural causes while incarcerated on a prison island named Patmos. John was the only of the 11, I'm not counting Judas, the only of the 11 who died of natural causes, but he died imprisoned for the faith as an old man. Philip preached in what would be called today Turkey, near Ephesus. He was crucified in AD 54, some 25 years roughly after Jesus had been crucified and raised from the dead. Bartholomew, who was also known as Nathaniel, preached the gospel in Mesopotamia, that would be modern-day Iraq, Persia, modern-day Iran, and India before his death, and he was murdered by idolaters in India. Thomas, the one we call the doubter, preached the gospel in Parthia, modern-day Iran, and in India, where to this day one can still visit the Mar Thomas Church in his honor. Thomas was killed by a spear in India. Matthew, also known as Levi, preached the gospel in Ethiopia, was killed by the sword. James, also known as James the Younger, stayed in Jerusalem and was beaten to death with a club. Jude, also known as Thaddeus, he wrote the book of Jude in the New Testament, was crucified in Edessa, Turkey in the year AD 72. And I point out the year of his death to show you that this was over 40 years after the resurrection. Simon, also known as Simon the Zealot, preached the gospel in Africa, was eventually crucified in what is today called Great Britain in the year AD 74, almost 45 years after the resurrection. Paul, who met Jesus on the road to Damascus, the risen Jesus, was beheaded by Nero in the late 60s. 10 of the 11 disciples died martyrs' deaths. The 11 died imprisoned on a prison island. Paul, whom some call the 13th apostle, was martyred and died by being beheaded. This wasn't groupthink. They weren't all thinking the same thing and encouraging one another to keep perpetrating this lie. They died separately. They died alone. They died in many cases thousands of miles from one another. If this was a lie, wouldn't one of them at some point have said, okay, I admit it. We made it all up. Some of you here today are old enough to remember Watergate. You remember Watergate? 1973, the break-in at the Democratic National headquarters, and then the cover-up that came afterward. I was thinking about that this week. There were roughly 12 people involved in that break-in and cover-up. You know how long it took for them to start ratting on each other? Once the FBI got involved and they started getting arrested, a few months. That's how long those 12 people kept that lie together. And within a year, all of them were in prison, and a president had resigned. They were able to keep that lie together for a matter of months. If the disciples stole the body and knew that Jesus was still dead, but they perpetrated this fraud, that means that these men, over a span in some cases of over 40 years, kept that lie. And at the point of death, when all they had to do was deny, all they had to do to say it was a lie, to avoid persecution or death, not one of them ever did that. No sane man would give up his life for something he knew to be untrue. And the fact that the disciples were willing to die rather than deny the resurrection of Jesus Christ for me is very strong evidence that Jesus rose from the grave. The last point, the seventh bit of evidence, the changed lives of those who saw Jesus after the resurrection. Jesus, the half-brother of Jesus, James rather. Do you know that James did not believe in Jesus during his lifetime? We actually are told that in the 7th chapter of John. James thought Jesus was touched. He thought there was something wrong with him. They were embarrassed by the things Jesus was saying. After he saw Jesus, after the resurrection, James went from being a critic of Jesus to a follower of Jesus and one of the pillars of the early church. Thomas went from doubting to faith as he fell down and worshiped the risen Jesus, John chapter 20. Peter went from being a coward who denied that he even knew Jesus to a bold preacher of the resurrection. Saul, after his encounter with Christ on the Damascus Road, went from being a persecutor of the church to its greatest defender and its greatest missionary. And the rest of the lives, the rest of the disciples, their lives were transformed as well. Though each and every one of them fled when Jesus was arrested and denied that they knew him, they later feared no one as they proclaimed the risen Jesus and went across the world and gave their lives for what they had seen. That's why I believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The broken seal, the stone rolled away, the Roman guard gone AWOL, the many witnesses who saw Jesus after his resurrection, the empty tomb, the martyr's death of the 12 disciples, and the changed lives of the people who claim to have seen him. Now, what does all that mean to you today? It means two things. It means, number one, if the resurrection of Jesus is true, it is the central fact of history. But number two, it has to do with your everyday life here and now. It means something for you right where you sit. If Jesus rose from the grave, it means you serve a risen Savior who is alive today. I love that song, we sang it earlier today. I serve a risen Savior. He's in the world today. And because he arose, that means that through his Spirit, he is your constant companion in your daily life. It means that he is only a prayer away no matter what you are going through. Billy Graham said once that during one of his early preaching ministry, before he was doing the Railroad Big Crusades, he was preaching in some tent meeting, and while he was preaching, someone yelled out, "God is dead!" To which Billy Graham replied, "That's strange because I just talked to him a few minutes ago in prayer." I like that. If Jesus rose from the grave, it also means that death is not the end. There is life beyond the grave. If the resurrection is true, I have a basis, a rational basis for my faith in an all-knowing, all-powerful God. Because if Jesus rose out of the grave, if he got out of those grave clothes and walked through a tomb, then molecular displacement is nothing for God. There's nothing that he cannot do. There is nothing that is too hard for him, not even death. In the Old Testament, Job asks the question, if a man dies, will he live again? The resurrection of Jesus tells us that the answer is yes. And because of the resurrection, we can now say with the Scriptures, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and that he shall stand in the latter day upon the earth. And though decay destroys the body, yet in my flesh shall I see God, whom my eyes shall behold." That promise is the basis of our hope for eternal life. And every time you stand at the graveside of a believer in Jesus Christ, you remember the promise of the one who returned from the grave to redeem us. That's why I believe in the resurrection and what I think it means for today. How about you? And if you believe, what have you done with your belief? Will you place your faith in him and commit your life to him this day? Let's stand together now as we sing. We're going to sing the first and third stanza of hymn number 407, "Because He Lives."